In this lecture, I'll discuss some of the main features of quantitative research. I'll offer a definition of quantitative research, and we'll go on to outline some of the types of questions that a quantitative approach might answer, as well as some of the most common methods employed within quantitative studies. Earl Babby defines quantitative research as focusing on gathering numerical data and generalizing it across groups of people, or to explain a particular phenomenon. Qualitative approaches, by contrast, are interested in the thoughts, feelings and experiences of research participants. These are things we might think of as internal to the participants, for example, things going on in their minds. Quantitative research, on the other hand, is concerned with things that can be externally observed, or is concerned with converting abstract concepts, such as attitudes, into something observable and empirically measurable. A qualitative study might seek to investigate a population's experience of a natural disaster in their local environment. A quantitative approach, on the other hand, might be interested in what proportion of that population was successfully evacuated when a disaster occurred. This suggests that quantitative research tends towards answering questions such as what, how many, or how much, questions in which an answer is derived from a process of counting quantities. However, quantitative research involves more than merely counting things. Grand Canyon University's Center for Innovation in Research and Teaching set out a typology of key research designs within quantitative approaches. Descriptive research is typified as an observational study that seeks to describe current status of a variable or phenomenon. So, for example, a descriptive study might uncover the viewing figures of a particular public information film on disaster preparedness. Correlational research is concerned with comparing two or more variables to determine correlations between them. So, for example, a study might want to compare government investment in disaster mitigation policies with public awareness of disaster preparedness. Often, this type of research employs a statistical analysis of variables to understand the significance of relationships between them. Descriptive and correlational research designs assign the researcher the status of an observer. By that I mean that the researcher does not directly intervene in the study. They do not change or manipulate the participants. Instead, they more passively observe what would have occurred if the researcher had not even been present. By contrast, experimental and quasi-experimental designs allow the researcher to make direct interventions into the experiences of the participants. Let's look at each of these. So a quasi-experimental design is interested in working out a cause and effect relationship between two or more variables. Some of the participants are exposed to the variable while others are not. We call this latter group a control group. The results are compared between the two groups. Importantly, the researcher does not carry out the process of assigning individuals to groups. Consequently, quasi-experimental designs lack randomization. So let me give you an example. A quasi-experimental design might study trust in a government's disaster mitigation practices among people who have experience of a disaster versus those who do not. The researcher is not going to expose people to a disaster. That would be unethical. So the researcher is not assigning people to the groups. They've already been assigned. An experimental design takes this further by establishing cause and effect relationships by controlling for all variables except the independent variable. Here, crucially, the researcher randomly assigns participants into specific groups. So, for example, an experimental design might test a new medication by taking a sample of the population and assigning that population into groups. Some groups are given the medication while others are given a placebo. The outcomes of these two groups are then compared. Using these research designs, quantitative studies within the social sciences employ a range of methods that include questionnaires, structured interviews, and quantitative content analysis. Let's think about some of these methods. A questionnaire is a document containing a series of questions designed to elicit very specific types of information. It is then subjected to detailed analysis. Often, but not always, the respondent fills in the document themselves. Questionnaires can vary in terms of how they are structured. For instance, some questionnaires allow respondents to answer questions using their own words. Other questionnaires might require more simple yes or no answers, or answers in which the respondent must select from one or more predetermined answers. Some questionnaires allow respondents to select an answer along a scale. There are numerous different types of scales used in questionnaires. The most common is called a Likert scale. Let me give you an example. A questionnaire might ask respondents how likely they are to heed warnings about a disaster in a particular situation. They might be able to answer highly likely, likely, not likely, etc. The use of a scale allows the researcher to measure in a quantitative manner something that is decidedly abstract, personal attitudes towards disaster warnings. An interview is very similar to a questionnaire. While a questionnaire often requires the respondent to fill in the questions either on paper or online, an interview, such as a phone survey or face-to-face interview, allows the researcher to write down the respondent's answers to a series of questions. As we noted in another lecture, interviews can be qualitative in nature. Qualitative interviews are less structured and allow the researcher to pick up on themes that might emerge organically from the respondent's answers. By contrast, quantitative interviews tend to be more rigorously structured. They require the respondent to give briefer answers to a series of predetermined questions. Quantitative content analysis involves the systematic study of communication content. Holsty refers to this method as any technique for making inferences by systematically and objectively identifying specified characteristics of messages. This method starts with the assumption that the features of communication content, the words mentioned and the phrases used, not only reflect the concerns of the authors, but also help to shape the perceptions of audiences. With this in mind, a quantitative content analysis might determine the frequency of word use in policy documents, the space devoted to a story in a newspaper, the frequency with which certain types of information sources are relied upon in a news report, the length of time a broadcaster devotes to discussing disaster mitigation policy, or the number of people who follow social media feed of a natural hazard observatory. The purpose of this method is to analyse communication texts with a view to creating numerical data that informs understandings of institutional policies, audiences' perceptions, or wider social discourses. As can be seen, quantitative methods tend to be more structured than qualitative. This means that, in the case of interviews and questionnaires, participants are more restricted in the types of answers they can provide. While there are costs to this approach, which I discuss in another lecture, there are also clear benefits, as quantitative research creates more easily manageable data that is consistent across respondents. This, in turn, helps the researcher to make comparisons between and across respondents. The systematic and formulaic structure of much quantitative research increases its replicability. That is to say, if you develop a rubric of interview questions for your research, these same questions can be used later by you or other researchers. This means that your original study can be compared to identical projects that study other sections of the population, or that study the same respondents after a specific time period. These types of methods allow for much larger data sets. This is because questionnaires are generally quicker to complete than in-depth interviews. Accordingly, data derived from quantitative studies can be used to generalize concepts more widely, predict future results and trends, and investigate correlative and causal relationships. In order to generalize quantitative data, it is important to think carefully about how you create samples. Sampling is a process that occurs in research whereby units, that is people or organizations for example, are selected or sampled from a larger population. These samples are studied, and the results of this study can be said to reveal something about that wider population. We call this wider population the sample frame. Essentially, it is often inefficient, if not impossible, for a researcher to study every single example of their chosen topic. As such, the researcher isolates smaller representative sample with a view to using the data to extrapolate to that wider population. The process of sampling is used in both quantitative and qualitative research, but as I've been talking about questionnaires, which often rely on sampling, it seems fitting to discuss sampling here. There are many different ways of generating a sample, but sampling techniques fall into two categories: probability and non-probability. Let's look at what each of these means. Probability sampling refers to the random selection of the sample. For example, you might have a population or sample frame and randomly pick a certain portion of the individuals within that population by, for instance, picking names out of a hat. Alternatively, you might employ systematic random sampling. Here you would list every individual in the sample frame and assign each individual a number. You would then sample at regular intervals. For example, you could pick every 10th individual on the list. On the other hand, you could choose stratified random sampling. This is where you divide your sample frame into groups according to a particular non-overlapping category and then randomly sample from within that category. For example, you might categorize your sample population according to gender and sample randomly from within each category. This would ensure, for example, an equal but random representation of men and women. Cluster random sampling is similar to this, but it seeks to categorize individuals according to location within a larger geographical area. For example, you might want to ensure that you have a representative sample of individuals from different neighborhoods in a given city. Sometimes a more practical approach is to use multi-stage sampling. This is where a combination of different sampling techniques is used. You might use cluster sampling to group samples according to geographic location, but then within those categories you might carry out stratified random sampling. So that's probability sampling. The other category is non-probability sampling. This type of sampling does not involve randomization. Non-probability sampling divides into two types: accidental or convenience sampling and purposive sampling. So what are each of these? Well, accidental or convenience sampling involves sampling people who happen to be available. For example, people who are in the vicinity at the time the researcher is seeking participants. Pilot studies within psychology departments, for example, often use the participation of psychology students because, well, they're available and they constitute a convenient sample. Purposive sampling, on the other hand, has a purpose in mind. In this instance, the researcher is looking for specific participants, perhaps according to ethnicity or gender. Perhaps, for the purposes of market research, the researcher is interested in surveying the views of men between 30 and 40 years of age. One form of purposive sampling is called expert sampling. Here, the researcher seeks to sample people who have particular expertise of a subject. Alternatively, the researcher may need to carry out quota sampling. Here, specific quotas of types of individuals are sought, for example, 50 men and 50 women. The 51st man and the 51st woman do not form part of the sample, as the quota has been met. On the other hand, the research may necessitate snowball sampling. In this case, the researcher identifies a person that meets the requirements of the study. That person is asked to recommend others who might form part of the sample. In turn, each of these people is asked to recommend someone until the sample is created. As mentioned, there are many different approaches to sampling, and it is important to, along with your project supervisor, make sure you pick the appropriate sampling technique for your project. In this lecture, I've outlined some of the principles of quantitative research, given an overview of some of the most relevant quantitative methods to your discipline, and offered an overview of some of the most prominent sampling techniques. This is, of course, just an introduction, and you are encouraged to conduct independent learning about other quantitative approaches.